I definitely felt at home, and I definitely went, this is for me. This is what this is what I want to do. I remember sitting in a theatre when I was 13 watching a commercial musical and just looking at the whole production going, this is incredible. I could never be on stage, but there's got to be a whole other group of people that make this happen. I think I feel quite comfortable being a stage manager. I think it's about, how you then shift that knowledge and understanding of the world into whatever project you're working on. And, in Australia, that can be, long-running shows. Like I've been very fortunate to be with Harry Potter for 3 years. How do I balance parenting and this crazy world? I think one of the things that I've definitely have found is there's a lot of excellent stage managers out there who are mums, and a lot of people have chosen not to stay in the industry or stay working full time, and it's definitely a real challenge.
Welcome to the Theatre Art Life podcast. Today we're talking with Rebecca Lockyer, otherwise known as Rex. Rex started working backstage at 15 and has stage managed for drama, ballet, circus, musical theatre, festivals and large-scale events, with a few wedding events thrown in for good measure. She particularly enjoys working as part of the leadership teams delivering large-scale touring productions and technically demanding resident shows. Rex lived and worked overseas for 10 years, primarily living in Macau as part of the stage management and artistic teams for the House of Dancing Water. Rex returned to Australia to work in tour producing, working with producers to tour live events into remote and regional areas of Queensland, giving her a new insight into the importance of arts in our communities. She has since returned to theatre as stage manager for the Australian production of Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, which closes its long-running season in 5 weeks' time. Rex is passionate about education and supporting the next generation of theatre professionals. She currently works for both QUT and VCA production students as a sessional lecturer and production mentor. Rex is also an advocate for working parents in the industry, particularly mums, as she juggles parenting 2 children alongside the demands of full-time stage management. Rex, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's exciting to be here, finally.
I know. We've been tracing you forever to get you here on this podcast. So tell us a little bit about, what was your first job working backstage at 15? What were you doing?
Oh, my God. I was like the shyest 15-year-old in the world, and I was a music student, and I wasn't a very good music student. I did choir, and I played piano, and I played trombone, but I definitely wasn't one of the exceptional students. And there came a time at high school where our music program sort of introduced a technical stream where you could, do all the backstage stuff. And I loved it and had such a great time learning the very, very basics, when you're 15 and at high school with quite a basic setup. And from there, one of my friends who was a dancer used to dance for one of the Queensland youth ballet companies. And she was like, we need crew, could you come and help out over the Easter weekend? And so I ended up backstage in a professional theatre with a part professional crew, with a whole bunch of kids as dancers, and I sort of never left. That's where I started, and I was lucky enough that little company then moved to one of the Queensland Performing Arts venues, centre venues, and I met my then mentor, and the rest is sort of a history.
So did you feel like, oh, this is for me, or you just went with the flow in terms of that work? You enjoyed it, or?
Look, I definitely felt at home, and I definitely went, this is for me. This is what I want to do. I remember sitting in a theatre when I was 13 watching a commercial musical and just looking at the whole production going, this is incredible. I could never be on stage, but there's got to be a whole other group of people that make this happen. And eventually found that, which was pretty exciting for me. And listened to my parents for probably, because you do listen to your parents, who said, you sure? Do you reckon you can make a living out of this? This is a pretty fickle industry. And they're right, it is, but 24 years later, still working. So yes, you can make a living out of it.
It's not always easy, but you can.
No, not always easy, but you can. Yeah.
What was your educational path from that point to then working professionally?
Look, I did a lot of sort of fringe work, a lot of semi-professional company work, community theatre. I stayed with Ballet Theatre of Queensland on and off for up until when I graduated uni, actually, which is actually really lovely because that company is now stage managed every year by a QT student, which is sort of a nice little legacy. Well, it was. I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but up until maybe 2 years ago, it was like that, which was really lovely. So I sort of went into uni a little bit older. Like I think I started when I want to say 21, which doesn't seem old, but when most of the cohort is straight out of school, you are 3 or 4 years older. I sort of went to uni, what I like to sort of say is a bit half-baked. Like I had a little bit of experience. So I was absolutely positive that this is what I wanted to do. So I definitely wasn't at all starstruck when I sort of started at uni, which was sort of nice. And then I went through the QT production course, which has changed names a number of times over the years, but essentially a fine arts in technical production. And then stepped out into started working professionally when I was in second year and went from there.
And the course was a general course, or was it focused on stage management?
It's a general course. So technical production across, from all areas. In my year group, in my cohort, there was quite a lot of stage managers. So I realised pretty early on that if I was going to have an interesting 3 years at uni, that I was going to have to branch out and do other things, and fell in love with lighting as well, and spent quite a bit of time as a lighting tech. And that's what paid my bills initially for the first 2 years out of uni, was being a lighting tech and a follow spot operator and a head electrician type person, and loved it. I've definitely, that skill set's probably not my strongest anymore because I haven't had to do any of it for such a long time. But I think it's really great. It's great in the sense that you do have the opportunity to do little bits of everything to give you a real appreciation for how everyone works together.
And how did you go from being a lighting tech to then sort of getting more stage management work? Like, how did you advocate for you doing that and get out of the tech roles?
When I first graduated, I definitely had a couple of stage management contracts, but at that time, there's only a certain number of companies offering contracts in Brisbane. The rest is freelance work. So I was a bit like, well, at least I've got lighting that can fill the gaps between my stage management contracts, which was really great. And, it meant that I was still getting work and I was still being seen by lots of different people, which was really, really beneficial. Hilariously, I got my first first commercial stage management contract from being a follow spot operator on Mamma Mia. I don't know which tour it was, maybe the second or the third time it had been through Brisbane, I'm not sure. But we did a benefit concert halfway through that season, and they were looking for volunteers essentially. And I was like, well, you don't need another follow spot. We're only using 2, I think, for that concert. Can I be an ASM? Can I be on the deck? And through that little concert, met the rest of the team, their stage management team. So when Mamma Mia closed and they moved on to the next thing, I got picked up as their ASM. So, it's all about the last random gig you do that leads to the next gig. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was your foray into stage management.
Yeah.
When did you feel like you really were a competent stage manager? And I say that because I feel like in my own personal journey, it was like not until I was about, I don't know, almost 30 that I felt like I could properly say myself that I was a stage manager, right? Like, how long did it make you feel that, because it's you do so many different things as a stage manager, especially in Australia, because you're jumping from job to job. Like, how did that feel for you?
Oh, I don't know. That's a hard one, because sometimes, there's definitely days even now that I'm like, do you actually have a handle on this? Because
I knew you were going to answer that question that way, because I still feel like that too.
Yeah, like I think, and I think every show is so different. And, I think I felt quite, by the time I sort of finished my contract on, it was Phantom. By the time I finished my contract on Phantom, I felt like I had a handle on that world as a deputy stage manager. But then I shifted and went across and, played in a festival for 6 months, and then went to Macau, and that was a whole different ball game. I think I think I feel quite comfortable being a stage manager. I think it's about, how you then shift that knowledge and understanding of the world into whatever project you're working on. And, in Australia that can be, long running shows. Like I've been very fortunate to be with Harry Potter for 3 years. So I feel like I know our world and how this building works and how our show works, exceptionally well. But then it'll be finding what that is on the next production. So I know stage management well. You've just got to flex it into whatever the job is on a daily basis virtually.
For those who may not be aware of the Australian art scene who are our listeners, would you describe a little bit about what that looks like? And I mean by the terms of, Harry Potter running for 3 years is kind of an unusual length of time for a production to run in Australia. So do you want to just give us a little bit of a brief about how that kind of works?
Yeah, I would say the majority of stage management work in Australia is contract or freelance work. So you get, even if you're working for the very established state theatre companies or the major performing arts organisations, you tend to go contract to contract to contract. You don't necessarily have a whole year's work or a full-time position mapped out for you within those companies. It depends. Some of those companies do have full-time people, but most of them go from one contract, which can last anywhere between a week to 12 weeks, depending on which company you're working for. So it's a little bit more freelance, I think, than the UK and the US, I think. That's
Right.
definitely my interpretation of it.
And generally, aside from Harry Potter, shows would run for how long? I mean, I know that Phantom ran for a long time and Harry Potter ran for a long time, but like other shows normally, how long are the runs in each city?
Well, runs in each city, anywhere between 6 weeks to 9 months, depending on which city it is and what show it is.
But 9 months is not a really long, that's not, like you said,
in the grand scheme of things, not, it's not a very long stint in the grand scheme of things, no. So,
and if you want to stay on that production as it goes from city to city, you're going to have to up your life and move to the next city with it, right?
Yeah. So if you look at the commercial musical touring shows, most of those contracts you'll be contracted for the run of play. So, and that could be, it could be one city, it could be 6 cities, it could be, and that, it could be anywhere between 8 weeks and 2.5 years. But within that 2.5 years, you'll move cities 6 or 7 times.
Which is pretty tough if you're a mum of kids, right?
Yeah, which is why I haven't done it since we returned back from Macau. So, yeah.
Tell us about what you learned from touring live events into remote and regional areas of like Queensland. What was that experience like?
Look, it was an incredible experience. I think you don't fully understand the importance of the arts in a community until you take a little show out to a regional centre that maybe has 50 people living in town and another 150 people living in the stations and the fringe around the town. And when you say you got 100 people at the one show you were doing in that particular town, and on paper you go, oh, there's only 100 people, but when you realise that that's 50 more than actually live in town, is actually a really incredible thing. And some of these towns, particularly these remote and regional Queensland towns that have dealt with, either floods or drought for the last 10 years virtually. So they either sitting in prolonged drought, and then quite often that's followed by a flood that then completely decimates the area again, and then they have to rebuild from that, and then they hit another drought. Like that's all they've dealt with for a really extended period of time. And quite often the only reasons for them to come together as a town are for, meetings about the state of the drought, meetings about how they've dealt with coming out the other end of a flood, or sadly, deaths within their community. Like when they come together for something that isn't any of those things, it's an incredible experience. They come together and just have a good night together and have fun as a community and laugh and sit with the company who's come to town and have a drink afterwards and get to share what their life is like with someone who's outside of their town is actually a pretty magic experience. And I don't think you can put a cost on that. You can't put a price on that. And it's a hard thing to quantify when you're looking at funding and when you're looking at particularly getting funding to go into those areas when on paper, like, that was just 100 people. But that was 100 people that have now had a really positive experience. And, and I don't think you can put a cost on that.
That sounds beautiful. What was the kind of projects or shows that you were taking to those areas?
The company I was working for did, it could be anything. Sometimes it was little bands. There's a fantastic little company called Little Match Productions that do little cabarets. So, and they, is a three-handed cabaret with a musician and a technician, and that can slot in virtually anywhere into little town halls that don't have any or very little technical support, or into sort of larger. Well, it used to be called the Narpaka Circuit. It's now been renamed. All the larger venues in like Gladstone and Macau and Mount Isa and Townsville. There's a whole string of sort of more established venues that have got more, better technical support. But the idea of these shows was that they could go into those bigger venues, or they could go into a little town hall that barely had a three-phase type thing. So, and they got such positive feedback, and sometimes people don't know what to expect, but it was also about making sure it was the right shows going into those communities. You couldn't just go, okay, well, we're going to send, this comedy show your way, because that's what we've got on offer. It was about, is this the right comedy show to go to your community as well? So.
And did you get to go out on some of the, did you get to go to many of those locations while you were working on the project?
I didn't get to go out on tour with the shows going on the road, but we used to do, every year there was a couple of weeks where we'd go out and visit and target certain centres and meet with as many people as we could to actually work with them and work out what actually they wanted to see, what their challenges were, and what the best next step for those communities were.
That's super cool.
Yeah, it was really cool.
I would like to go see those shows in the middle of nowhere. I remember years ago when I used to tour the Rock of Stedford to some of those remote areas, it was always a riot out there trying to make a show happen in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, and also I think, touring in Queensland is so vastly different from touring in even Victoria, because in Queensland you can drive 4.5 hours and have only just hit the next little community, as opposed to I feel like in Victoria you can drive an hour and a half, 2 hours, and have hit the next community that's got actually a pretty decent venue. Whereas, and touring in Queensland, sometimes you can't get more than 2 shows a week just based on how much you have to travel between locations to actually, 1, travel safely, 2, give yourself the setup time, and then do a show and then move on. The drives are insane.
Is that program still running?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Under a different banner, but it is, yes.
Yeah. So what's your your experience overseas as compared to work in Australia? When you compare working in Macau versus the Australian art scene.
Oh, God.
And now a note from our sponsor. The Theatre Art Live podcast is proud to be sponsored by Clearcom. Clearcom is the leader in voice communications for theatre and the performing arts. Call your cues with the simplicity and elegance of Clearcom Intercom Solutions. You can find them at clearcom.com. Go check them out. Miles different, right?
So just vastly different in terms of, also when you're working in Macau and you're working for a massive commercial entity, just the financial side of things is hugely different. So, there was money for that show, and it was specifically to put the House of Dancing Water on. And initially there was definitely a sort of no expense spared type, it costs a lot of money to put shows of that scale on, and to make sure that they're safe and they're going to continue and sustainable. Vastly different when you're talking about putting on, a massive mega show on in a casino in Macau compared to getting a 4-hander show out to regional Queensland to completely, just completely different scales, but of equal importance, I think. So,
yeah, exactly. So what did you sort of take away? Did you take anything away from Macau that you sort of brought back to Australia, or no?
Oh, definitely in terms of teamwork, because I don't think I've ever valued a team as much as I did the team working in Macau, and that's across the board, and valuing everyone's different skill sets, because there was absolutely no way in Macau that I could even pretend like I knew, a smidge of what it was like to be an automation programmer or a rigger on that show, or underwater with the scuba team. Like, just the teamwork that came from a production like that, and all the varied skill sets, was definitely something I took into how do we make this work on the road with a 4-person team.
And what was your, because I know that your children were born in overseas, what was your motivation to return to Australia when you left Macau?
The motivation at that point was definitely that my parents were aging. Like, there's, oh my God, closer to 80 now than 70, I guess. And it was time, and I valued relationship with my cousins and my extended family and as a kid. And it was just getting harder to do that, in Macau for our family. And also definitely Owen, my eldest, who you obviously know, he's a little bit more needs his tribe, and it was just getting a little bit, he was finding it harder and harder year to year, watching his friends leave every year. So that's definitely been one thing for him back here that's been really important, which was, finding that stability with a cohort of kids. So, which he's got now in Melbourne, which is really great.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of the big challenges of living in an expat world is how transient most of the friendships can be as families come and go from a region. So I totally get that. Still navigating that.
Yeah, and I mean, he still says that his best friends are India and Benjamin. Benjamin now lives in Singapore. They left Macau before we even left, actually. But he's still his best friends in his mind are definitely still his friends from Macau. So it's great that he's found his cohort, and he's got plenty of friends and footy mates and all of that sort of thing. But he still very fondly remembers that period of time.
That's really good that it has such an impact on, because one of the things the benefits is because they're so isolated from larger family networks, those friendships actually become really important, right? And quite significant in their lives. I think India talks, always the same about Owen as being a significant Macau friend, even though they haven't been around each other for years now.
Well, and also too, like, every now and then Owen will say, oh, I wish we could go back to Macau, and then having to explain that, most of the families that we were close with in Macau, with a couple of exceptions, have all moved on. So it's and explaining that, that world has changed too. So hard concept for a 10-year-old to understand that world's not exactly the same, but,
Yeah, exactly. But it's the truth.
Yeah.
So staying on the topic of parenting and things like that, how does that balance work for you in terms of your motivation or what you're applying for, or how you go about your work, and how do you win in that, or do you win in that?
I don't know. I definitely feel like I don't win in it a lot of the time. I think it's a hard one because I will say that Harry Potter is a very family-friendly company. We're very, my kids have spent a lot of time backstage. There's quite a few kids that have spent some time, time in the building. It's not unusual for one of them to come with me on a Sunday to do cast change, to then get picked up a little bit later on. So, we're pretty family-friendly building. Obviously not during the shows, because we can't have kids around backstage during the show. It's, it's been a very open company across the board with both cast and crew, with, kids getting sick or there being family things you need to attend to. And, including, and Smurf's going to kill me for mentioning this, but including a child getting left on a train in the middle of a tech one day when Smurf was babysitting her. Like, I had to go and deal with that. It's a whole thing. Nothing like a phone call in the middle of the transition tech going, Imogen's on a train. I was like, with you? She's like, no. So yeah, that was fun. It's a whole, yeah. It's a story that I'm pretty sure Smurf is quite traumatized by. Smurf is my best friend. Definitely not her actual name, but that's her nickname. She's very traumatized by it. Imogen thinks it's the best joke in the world these days, which is a good thing. I'm glad she wasn't traumatized. Yeah. She's not been permanently scarred by being left on a train. Anyway, am I winning at how do I balance parenting and this crazy world? I think one of the things that I've definitely have found is there's a lot of excellent stage managers out there who are who are mums, and a lot of people haven't been able to have chosen not to stay in the industry or stay working full time, and it's definitely a real challenge. It's been particularly post COVID when we kept coming back to work and we kept getting shut down again. And it was this whole cycle of, are we working, are we not? And then every time we came back to work, it was having to sort of acclimatize the family to me working nights again, which is, was one of the biggest challenges. I like, and there's also quite a few performers now who are working and with young children, and both mums and dads. And I think, the more we do it, the more it'll become a little bit more the norm, and a little bit more, okay, we have people with children, and how we make that work within the company. And I think the more people who do it, the easier it becomes in a way.
How do you think that, because I know that some people have asked me in other contexts, and I think it's really unfair to compare my life in Hong Kong when I've got obviously much more affordable childcare in a situation where those things are easier, but in Western culture, childcare is expensive and that sort of thing. How do you think that, what can companies do better, or how can they be better advocates for that kind of family environment in terms of what they allow? What do parents need?
What parents need is what theatre working parents need, and also really anyone who works anything but the 9 to 5, is the ability to access childcare that sits within like the shift working hours. Like it's quite complicated. There are avenues within the Australian government system to access childcare for people who do work, beyond the 9 to 5 world, but it's really complicated and super expensive. So, and there is some access to subsidy associated with that, but it's so convoluted that, to be able to get, say, because it all falls under like the nanny world, to get a nanny, it has to be people with certain qualifications, and it's just a whole great big long list of things, and it's not particularly easily accessible. So I think anything a company can do to assist in providing better access to easier access to childcare, it would be hugely beneficial. But I feel like that also needs to come from a more government change as opposed to directly involved with companies. So, I mean, how we make it work in my family is that my husband no longer works in the industry. So he works tradie hours from 6 until 4 or 6 until 3, and I work the opposite end of the day. So I do mornings, he does nights, essentially. So yeah, I think it's a real challenge having two parents working in the industry, particularly with school-age kids.
That's right. And also that must mean that there's limited time between the two of you spending time together because shifts.
Yeah,
right.
Shifts in the night a bit, yes.
Shifts in the night. That's super interesting. What would you? I mean, do you think that then that obviously you've been a parent for about 10 years now, so has that gotten better, or in terms of? I mean, you said that the Harry Potter company is quite accepting of families.
Yeah.
So, but do you think generally being accepting of what those, and maybe post-pandemic too, because people definitely post-pandemic are advocating for their own time and rights and stuff going back to work. Do you think there's a shift there?
Yeah, I think there's been I think the one positive thing that's come out of COVID is that shift, is that, and I think it goes hand in hand with the fact that we did lose a massive chunk of the workforce through COVID. There was a lot of technical staff and production staff and stage managers who moved on to other things through the pandemic. So I think, it's put the people who have remained in a little bit more of a position to be able to advocate for that in a more positive fashion. And there's definitely been a shift towards more work-life balance, which is nice. There's definitely a little bit, I've heard of more incidences of job sharing, which I know is more common on Broadway and West End than it definitely is here. A bit more job sharing, a bit more openness to a bit more flexibility, which is a really positive thing.
And you also teach QUT and VCA students. What do you teach? What do you do with them?
QUT wise, I've done a whole bunch of lectures on resident shows, which has been interesting, and I do a similar lecture every year with the first years and the second years, which is really great because you can see their progression, and you can sort of develop on the lecture that you give every year as well. VCA, I've just started doing some mentoring with them, so you end up being a sort of assigned a production and a group of students, and you mentor that group of stage management students for that production that they're working on, which has been really interesting. And the quality of the students is exceptional, and it's a lot of fun to be involved with that level of training and seeing who's coming through the ranks and where their training is at, and what skill sets are being developed at uni. Yeah, it's been a really positive thing.
Yeah. What would you say advice do you give to them, or generally to young stage managers trying to make a sustainable career in Australia?
I think the most boring advice I give them, I think, and if any of the students I've had in the past are listening, they're going to go, "Yep, she said this a lot." And I think it's something that we don't necessarily take on board until it's a little bit too late, which is, first one, look after your physical health. Because there's just been too many people who have to leave the industry because they've, hurt their knees, hurt their backs, just from the physical side of things. But also look after your mental health and your workload. I think as a freelancer, it's super easy to be like, "Oh, I've been offered this gig. Oh, I have this, 2-week gap and I've been offered 2 weeks work. Great. Okay, I'll do that gig, and then there's 4 more weeks, and then I'll get a couple of weeks off." And then if you keep doing that, you get to the end of like 3 years and go, "Okay, well, I've had a day," and that's when people fall over and burn out. And it's learning how to balance that freelance world of, actually sit there and go, "Okay, when is the quiet time in the city that I work in?" It's likely to be the end of January, the start of February. Maybe I'll take 2 weeks holiday here, or take some time here. So actually make sure that you find that balance. On the, and going hand in hand with that is have an interest outside the theatre. I know it sounds really silly, and I know everyone's really, we tend to be very passionate about what we do, but have something else that you can use to switch off from whatever it is you're working on right now, to be able to actually give yourself some downtime. Because, at 21, I definitely did not understand that. But now, 20 years later, I understand the importance of that.
Yeah. That's really, really sound advice, I would say. I don't think I programmed any kind of vacation in for the first 10 years.
No, absolutely did not. And also you're going, how am I paying my next lot of rent? So you tend to not think like that at all, but don't yet understand the value of downtime.
Yeah, because I think you come from that kind of scarcity mindset, right? Like if there's work there, you should take
Absolutely.
it, and you never know when it will stop. And yeah, so then you get into that cycle.
Yep. And it's really easy to get into that cycle. And the thing is, you don't want to crash and burn on something that you want to be a part of. You don't want to crash and burn mid-production because you're so exhausted and burnt out. And then that's what and then that's what your last memory of being in that part of the industry is either. So yeah. It's finding the balance.
Exactly. We always finish our podcast with 2 questions, so I'm going to ask you these now. What's your most favorite thing about your job or the industry?
Look, my most favorite thing, I think it's the teams I work with. No matter, and people, my favorite part of any show, and people laugh when I tell them this, is the moment from when you get house clearance and you start the announcements running, if you've got to record an announcement, if you're not doing it live. Because no matter how crazy the day has been, no matter how ridiculous the cast change is and how late everything's run and how busy things have been, at that moment, every single person in the building's brains switch over to the 100% focus on doing our show together. And it's together. It's a team effort. It's not just the cast on stage. It's not just the crew backstage. It's not just me out the front as a show caller or whoever's calling that night. It's a whole team of people making this one beautiful production work. And I just don't think that can be underestimated.
I totally agree. It's really interesting post, me leaving actually calling shows, how that wiring of delivering something daily is ingrained in you, and it is such a discipline, right? You just have to drop everything and do it, and that can carry on even when you're not doing shows, where you're like, okay, let's just do it and get it done, because you're wired to do that and get it. And I feel like I'm not much of a procrastinator, because I've delivered shows nightly for years, right? So if it's ready to go, do it, get it done. So it's a good wiring.
Yeah.
If you could change one thing about your job or the industry, what would it be?
Oh geez, there's a lot of little things, and I know there's a lot of people who go, oh, the pay, because sometimes the financial side of things can be challenging. One thing, I guess it's the not knowing. It's quite an odd thing to be a part of, when as a stage manager you like organization and coordination and knowing what's next, to be in an industry that you have no idea at the end of this job where you're going next. So I think maybe it's sort of the unpredictability of knowing what's next and employment. So I think that's probably the biggest thing.
Especially when you're trying to manage a family, right?
Yeah, like it's actually quite interesting. I'm in the middle of sort of thinking about what's next after Harry Potter, because we close in 5 weeks. And I think if it was just me, if I didn't have to think about my husband and 2 kids, I know exactly what I'd be doing. And that's super exciting. And it's a lot of fun, and it's a great team of people. And then on the flip side, you're like, but hang on a minute, it's not just me. It's 3 other people. So, and what that also means for my village in Melbourne, because if I go and do this, then we'll need a whole lot of extra village support, which is great, which is fine, and it'll happen. But it's just like, it's a very different world when you're factoring in more than one person.
That's right. Rex, so thank you so much for joining the Theatre Art Life podcast. It's so good to see your face and sharing your work with us.
Thanks for having me.